All right, let's get right into it. For well over a century, there's been this predictable, kind of depressing pattern, right? Debt gets way too big, governments fire up the printing presses, and then poof, entire economies just collapse. But what if I told you that a small handful of countries have consistently, and I mean consistently, outsmarted every single major financial crisis? Today, we're breaking down their playbook, the anti-fragility framework.
You know, it's really the biggest mystery in modern economics. We keep seeing the same disaster movie play out over and over. A few bad decisions, a little too much borrowing, and boom, total ruin. It feels almost inevitable. And yet, there are these few countries that seem to have written a completely different script. And they don't just get lucky once, they nail it every single time a crisis hits.
And this really lays it out perfectly. On one side, you've got a long and frankly growing list of countries that just keep falling into the same old traps. But on the other side, you've got these resilient outliers. So the big question is, what do they know that everyone else doesn't? Let's unpack their blueprints one by one.
Okay, so principle number one is all about building a financial fortress. And for this, we're looking at the masters, Switzerland, a country that has spent centuries intentionally walling itself off from all the chaos raging right outside its borders.
I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. The 20th century tore Europe to shreds. We're talking 2 world wars, insane hyperinflation, bloody revolutions. And there's Switzerland, right in the heart of it all, just staying out of it every single time. Now, this wasn't luck. This was a deliberate long-term strategy.
So how'd they pull it off? Well, they turned their political neutrality into a killer economic strategy. First, by just refusing to get dragged into other people's wars, they were saving and accumulating wealth while all their neighbors were printing money like crazy to fund their armies. Second, they had incredible monetary discipline. The Swiss franc was backed by gold all the way up to the year 2000. That meant the government literally couldn't print money it didn't have. And third, all of this built trust for centuries. So when the 2008 crisis hit, people didn't run from the Swiss franc, they ran to it for safety.
All right, let's pivot to our second principle. See, the Swiss model worked because they had a fortress to protect. But what do you do when you start with absolutely nothing? This is the incredible story of Singapore. This quote just says it all, doesn't it? Back in 1965, Singapore was literally kicked out of Malaysia. It was this tiny island, about half the size of Los Angeles, with zero natural resources, no farmland. It didn't even have its own supply of fresh water. By every possible measure, it was completely doomed. So how on earth did it become one of the wealthiest places on the planet in a single generation? Its first leader, a guy named Lee Kuan Yew, had this incredibly pragmatic 3-step plan. First, he made a huge bet on the rule of law. Contracts were sacred and corruption was crushed. That made it a super safe and predictable place to do business. Second, he figured if you don't have any resources of your own, you become the essential hub for everybody else's. So Singapore became the go-to center for trade, finance, and shipping in the region. And third, they saved like their lives depended on it, creating these massive government-owned investment funds that today are worth over $1 trillion.
Okay, now for a totally different kind of problem. What happens when you suddenly get an enormous, almost unbelievable amount of money? This brings us to principle number 3, and the Norwegian model of managing a windfall.
So, back in 1969, Norway discovered a massive amount of oil. They could have spent it all, and most countries would have. Instead, they saved. And this number, nearly $2 trillion for a population of just 5 million people, is the result. That's about $350,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country. Just staggering.
And this slide really highlights what's known as the resource curse. For countries like Venezuela or Nigeria, finding oil was actually terrible for them. It led to corruption, instability, and chaos. For Norway, it became the foundation of the world's biggest savings account. The difference wasn't the oil, it was the discipline.
And here is the secret sauce, the fiscal rule. It is an absolute masterpiece of long-term thinking. The government doesn't get to touch the money from selling the oil, and it definitely can't touch the main pot of savings. They can only spend a tiny slice of the investment returns, about 3% a year. This one simple rule forces them to save and stops politicians from blowing the windfall on short-term vanity projects. It's genius.
Our fourth principle is a little different. It comes from a country that isn't on this list because it avoided disaster. It's on this list because it survived 2 of the most catastrophic economic collapses in modern history, and then built its entire culture around making sure it never ever happened again.
This timeline shows the deep, deep scars that shaped Germany's economic DNA.
In 1923, hyperinflation didn't just hurt the middle class, it completely vaporized their savings. People were literally using wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. Then, just a couple of decades later, after World War II, the country was in ruins, and its currency was worthless. Again. They hit rock bottom not once, but twice in a single generation.
And this history isn't just something you read about in a textbook over there. It is burned into the national psyche. That memory of total disaster created this intense cultural hatred of debt and inflation. For decades, the German central bank was famous for being laser-focused on keeping the currency stable, because Germans know firsthand, in a very personal way, what happens when you lose it.
And that brings us to the final piece of this whole framework. And it might just be the most important one. The story of Botswana proves that these principles aren't just for rich European nations. Nope, they are completely universal.
Get this, when Botswana became an independent country in 1966, it had a grand total of 12 kilometers of paved roads, and the entire country. It was one of the absolute poorest nations on Earth. You literally could not start from a lower point. So this just demolishes that myth that you need to be rich to become resilient.
And that is the absolute core of it all. When diamonds were discovered there, Botswana didn't fall victim to the resource curse like so many of its neighbors. The government made smart, fair deals. They invested the money in schools and hospitals. They maintained a stable democracy. They had the same challenges and the same geography as countries that completely failed. The only thing that was different was the quality of their decisions.
So here it is, the whole thing in one place. The 5-step anti-fragility framework. Number 1. Strategically insulate yourself from other people's chaos, the Swiss model. 2. If you have nothing, make yourself essential, like Singapore. 3. If you get a windfall, don't spend it, invest it for the future, like Norway. 4. Use the pain from your worst failures to build your greatest strengths, just like Germany. And finally, number 5, remember that it's your decisions, not your destiny, that determine your outcome. That's the lesson of Botswana.
And that really leaves us with one last pretty challenging thought. These principles, they don't just apply to countries. They apply to a business, they apply to your career, they apply to your own personal finances. It isn't about being lucky or being a genius. It's about discipline and smart decisions. So, looking at this list, which of these are you already doing? And more importantly, which one have you been ignoring?